If you were to call this ND Miata right in front of me an NC Miata, well, you would not be 100% wrong. Well, you might be 90% wrong, and that's because this ND Miata has an NC Miata transmission as well as a differential from a Fiat 124 Abarth. Now, I'd love to tell you guys this story about how this car came to be the way it is, as it's so fascinating, and I think it's going to be very helpful for other people who will go on this endeavor to swap their ND Miata transmission to an NC Miata. So without further ado, let's talk about this. YouTube has this thing called like the like button or something. I heard it like boost the channel or something. So if you guys could just go down there really quick, hit that like button, I would appreciate that so much. Hit that subscribe button too while you're down there. So really the big question is, why in the world did I do this? Well, there's actually a great reason for it, and that is reliability and torque. So this ND Miata is actually turbocharged. We see under here the turbo nestled down there. And with all that added torque, the ND Miata transmission was never meant to run with that much torque. The ND Miata transmission was actually made for the 1.5 liter models that were introduced in Europe, but they bring this 2-liter Skyactiv engine for cars in the US. So this transmission was not even meant for this 2-liter engine, so they were already pushing the limits installing this engine onto that transmission. And now put a turbo as well on there, you can see how we're really pushing the limits of that transmission. And it's no surprise that my ND Miata transmission failed after just about 800 miles of turbocharged use. So I knew I had to find a better solution, and upon researching around, you can actually get an NC Miata swap for your ND Miata, and that's exactly what I did. Now the thing is, it's not as easy as it seems. It may seem on the surface that you can just swap the ND Miata transmission with an NC Miata, right? But not exactly, because there's different mounting patterns for each engine. There are different engines from the NC to the ND Miata series. So we're going to see different bolt patterns as well as different gear ratios, which actually requires you to get the transmission installed, a new one, as well as the differential as well. So when I got the NC Miata transmission, I actually needed to get a differential that had the same gear ratio, because if I were to keep the stock rear differential, the gearing would be way off, extremely short, and it would be horrible to drive. So I needed to get a differential that was in line with the NC Miata transmission. And believe it or not, the NC Miata and the Fiat 124 Abarth use the same transmissions and differentials. So what I did is that I went online and found a Fiat 124 Abarth Spider differential, which is actually a limited slip differential, and I got that installed. I installed it myself in the back, and I'll show you guys a video right now of that whole process. Had to completely drop that rear subframe and really get into the car. It was a very extensive job. I would not recommend to do it yourself if you're not mechanically inclined, but if you got a few weekends to burn as well as some strength, because you have to haul that differential in there, as well as some patience, because it's a complex job, but it's very doable if you want it done. If you really believe in yourself, you could do it, but it's not for the faint of heart. So you need the NC Miata transmission, you need a differential from an NC Miata or a Fiat 124 Abarth, depending if you want an open diff or a limited slip. I'd recommend, if you're already dropping the subframe, get the limited slip differential from the Fiat 124 Abarth. And now, with those two components, you also need an adapter plate, which you can see here. I'll show you guys an in-depth look. You can see this silver piece right here. That's a little bit brighter than the rest. That's the adapter plate that allows you to put an NC Miata transmission onto your ND Miata engine. Now, what's pretty infuriating about this is that the adapter plate is like $1,100. So if you are going to do this, it's quite costly, and there's really nothing you can do about it. I believe Flying Miata is the only brand that sells those adapter plates, so you need that adapter plate if you want to run an NC Miata transmission. And then of course you need to get a NC Miata clutch and flywheel, because an ND Miata clutch and flywheel will not work with the NC Miata transmission and the ND. Like, when you're getting the adapter plate from the engine forward, it's an NC Miata, which is it's quite funny, but it's awesome. And in terms of shiftability, or how the shifter feels inside, it feels great. I honestly like this a little bit more than the stock version. The ND transmissions feel a little toyish, but this one is solid. You guys can hear. Still 6-speed, and it's actually a little bit shorter in gearing. When I'm on the highway at about 80 miles an hour, I'll be at probably 3,500 RPM. So it's definitely geared more towards the shorter side, but still very doable on the highway. Nothing to be concerned about. So we talked about what you need. Now let's talk about how much dollars you need, because these modifications are not super cheap. So let's just start from the very top. We have the clutch and flywheel, which ran about $300 for me. You also need that adapter plate, which, as I said, was about $1,100. That was probably the most expensive thing about this build. Then we got the NC Miata transmission, which I paid about $500 for. Pretty good deal on that. Then we also have the Fiat 124 Abarth differential, which ran me about $900. So do the math on that, put them together. I'll put it on the screen right now how much that all costed together roughly. But yeah, just to give you guys an idea about how much to expect if you want to swap your ND Miata with an NC Miata transmission. And just to dive a little bit further in terms of the viability, or can you do this on your own? Well, I'll put it this way. I did it myself in my garage with a couple jack stands and a lot of weekends. So it's doable on your own, or even better if you have a buddy. You really want to have a buddy when you're putting that transmission in there, hoisting it up. But it's a tough job. If you are not up for being a little bit stressed, punching the wall sometimes because things aren't working or things aren't fitting, I would recommend to have some kind of dealer or some professional do it. It's definitely a very, very thorough and intensive job. It involves dropping the subframe, taking out the transmission. You might as well swap the pilot bearing as well and the rear main seal while you're in there. So I would rate this job probably a 9 out of 10 in terms of DIY difficulty. It's probably one of the most thorough jobs to do on your car, maybe besides like a complete engine deconstruction. I would label that a lot more harder, but it's fairly straightforward. At the end of the day, it's drop the subframe, put these big components in, unlike an engine rebuild where you have all these little parts falling apart and you're losing everything. It's not quite like that with the transmission swap. Everything's straightforward, bunch of big parts. You just have the transmission, you have the differential, and it's hard to go wrong. It's just when things end up not fitting very well, you know, it can get very frustrating. So not for the faint of heart. So now let's talk long term. How has this car been handling the NC Miata transmission? And as far as I can tell, for the past 20,000 miles, very well. No problems whatsoever. I love the feel of the transmission. Everything's been working seamlessly. So as long as you do the job right, it's going to be 100% reliable. I've beaten on this turbo a lot, although I don't clutch dump every single day. I definitely put this car through its fair share and through the ringer up in the canyons and all that. And as long as you don't extremely abuse the car, so far I've put 20,000 miles of spirited driving on it, and it has not been an issue. So I would give this a good reliability score. I would not be super concerned about it blowing up, and I'd feel way more safer driving an NC Miata transmission with that turbo than an ND Miata transmission. I hope this video was informative to you guys if you ever plan to take the grand adventure of swapping your transmission on your ND Miata. It was an awesome job, crazy experience, but it completely changed this car, and I think it made it way more reliable to hit on the track, up the canyons, anywhere with that turbo. So if you guys got any more questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll make another video about it potentially. But yeah, for now, peace out.